So I think we have most of the people who are coming in, though we still have a few people joining us. Amazingly, we are up to 183 people here, which is pretty amazing and definitely more than we could fit in either store.
That's right.
And I know we have some people from as far away as Arizona and some people who I recognize who live a few blocks away. So we are near and far. But David, why don't you go ahead and start with the introductions?
All right. Well, one of the many reasons that I was looking forward to tonight was the sheer pleasure of once again getting to introduce Archer Mayer. And he's one of the best people to be able to do that because I can emphasize his role as a death investigator, as a detective, as a engaging speaker with entertaining tales of criminals, or the regularly appearing, regularly diminishing physician brother of his, as a New York Times bestseller, who has just last year published the 30th volume of the critically acclaimed Joe Gunther series, Bomber's Moon. And so I get to say all these wonderful things about him. And there you have it. Archer Mayer.
And I get the great privilege of introducing Julia Spencer-Fleming this evening. She was one of the earliest authors that I got to host in our Saratoga store after the store opened. That was around about the 2013 release of Through the Evil Days. So I was a brand new baby bookseller, and it was such an incredible privilege to hear her speak that night about that book. And since then, my great admiration and respect for her work have just grown and grown and grown. She has won just about every mystery award that there is. The Agatha, Anthony, Dillis, McCavity, and Gumshoe Awards, all of them she's won. And her wildly popular Ferguson Van Alstyne series is set in a fictionalized version of Washington County, New York. So just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now in my dining room. And we are incredibly lucky to have her here tonight because we're celebrating the release of her new book, Hid from Our Eyes, which has been very, very hotly anticipated. So everyone, please join us in welcoming Archer Mayer and Julia Spencer-Fleming.
Hi, Julia. Good to see you again.
It is good to be seen.
It's been too long.
We are distantly socializing.
Julia, you and I go way too far back. We used to be on the telephone to each other, not all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to remember the first time we did an event together, and I was trying to remember if it was at the Brattleboro Literary Festival, maybe.
Oh my goodness! I thought it was in Maine. So
it may have been in Maine, but I was a very, very new, very. You doing me a favor by coming along and helping out at an appearance, because you had quite a few books already under your belt. We'll just say that you started writing when you were 15 years old.
Five. I was very precocious. and I knew a lot about murdering people, so that helped.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about sort of, first, I feel like what we ought to say always is, how are you doing? How is being at home? Are you able to stay at home and be safe? What are you doing out there in Vermont?
My life is essentially unchanged because I work at home and I stay at home until I'm called out for a dead body because I'm a death investigator. And so I still do that. So essentially nothing is altered. I'm still going out. I just wear more stuff. How about you? How's life for you? I'm a boring story in today's day because nothing's going on. So tell me how are you handling this?
I feel that for I feel that for most writers, those of us who are lucky enough to have this as our day job, life hasn't really changed very much. You know, we work from home, we spend a lot of time staring at a computer screen. That much has not changed. I am teaching a class at our local community college, which I've had to up stakes and put online, and that has been more of a challenge. Ironically, the reason that I accepted the job offer was because I thought it would be good for me to have something that got me out of the house on a regular basis. So I wasn't spending all of my time in my office, which is where I am right now, you know, staring at the computer screen. And now I'm just doing it twice as much because I'm doing it for work and I'm doing it for the community college. And I've got youths living back here. Again, my youngest daughter is at the University of Maine. She's come back. She has a friend who was unable to go to his house. He's living with us. And my millennial daughter, who is a newspaper columnist, just by her, that's her side gig, as the millennials like to say. She is here, and she is one of the now, what is it, 20 million people unemployed. She got laid off last week from her main job. So, you know, we're getting to see some of the effects here. Fortunately, I have an enormous 200-year-old farmhouse. So there's enough space for everybody to be in their own place without getting on each other's nerves.
Wow.
Too much.
That's crucial. That's crucial, because in my old days as a cop, I would encounter people who were getting each other's nerves all the time. So tell me something, Julia. You referenced that, as indeed is the case, both of us are blessed with staying at home and scribbling for a living.
Yeah.
But you took a approximately 8-year hiatus. What did you do during that time? Were you writing and we just don't know about it?
I was doing a little bit of that. What it was is life. Just, you know, the saying that everybody has, life comes at you fast. I had started working on what is now hid from our eyes, and had just family stuff. My two oldest kids were boomerangers. They came back home, and each of them needed support and mothering and caretaking, you know, in their own individual ways. And then I had some health issues that made it really hard for me to write. And then I got better and was working on the book once again. And in 2016, the fall of 2016, my husband Ross, whom you may remember, curly redhead, big beard, he came home. He said he had a pain in his hip. And it turned out to be malignant melanoma. And he was ill for the better part of a year. And then he passed away in 2017. And I could not work for about a year afterwards. I just didn't have it in me. And I know writers who do, you know, Louise Penny, who is just a wonderful person and writer. She threw herself into work after her husband passed away. I just didn't have anything there. So I went, like I said, for about a year, and then I started in again at the book, and I seriously considered just chucking what I had. You know, it had been put together in so many pieces over such a large period of time. And it was a real, like, ugly patchwork at that point. But I got some really great encouragement from other writer friends. I blog with a group of women writers, and they, you know, you really need to get back on the horse and ride it to the end of the road. And I did, and I'm glad I did. Although I must say, Hid from Our Eyes took more editorial work than I have ever had on any other book, because it was, by the time I finished it, I didn't want to ever look at this book again. I mean, I didn't even want to open it up and read it to do the copy edits. So my editor, you know, would send me a couple notes, and I'd do something, I'd fix this and I'd add that. And then he'd say, that's good. Now, why don't you try this? And so I'd fix that and I'd add this. And he sort of coaxed me like, I don't know, like a mule with a carrot or something, gradually into, into actually finishing, doing all the rewriting and the polishing that it needed. So that was a unique experience. But amazingly, once I finished, dropped the book, finished the edits, I was good to go. And I'm working on the 10th book now, and it feels great. It's nice to be.
That was my next question. Since my job, my day job, night job, my other job, calls on me to visit people in grief and in loss and in recent mourning all the time. And you're right that the span is extraordinary. I obviously feel for your loss enormously, because sadly, we've sort of all been there one way or the other, not necessarily as personally as you, but it's a terrible situation to go through. And you do have to go on. You have to, and that's hard. So given all of that, writing hid from her eyes, do you think now that you've got wind back in your sails, do you feel that the book that you're facing now, the one that you're writing now, is a more enriching, easier, more less onerous process than actually getting back into the saddle and reintroducing yourself to the horse?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you may not have this experience because you are one of the most regularly producing writers I know. I mean, you could set a watch by when when your books come out. But it's harder. I mean, if you take a couple days off, it's a Christmas time and you've got family stuff and you take 5 days off, it's hard to get back into writing then. I've always compared writing to exercise. It's also not my favorite thing to like. Writing exercise is always best when it's already been done. You've done it for the day. But, if you get up and you lace on your shoes or whatever it is you do, and you go out and you do your run or you do your yoga class or what have you, if you do it every day, it doesn't hurt. If you wait in between, it's gonna, those muscles are gonna hurt when you try and hit the road again.
Yeah. No, I hear you loud and clear. I work out every day and I hate it every day. And there are times I write all the time, obviously, and there are times I hate doing that too. And the alienation is, you are so correct. It's funny right now. I took a little bit of a break. I'm on page 100 of book 32, and I broke my cycle. I'm okay, but there have been other previous experiences where I've literally had to reread the entire book from page 1 to even figure out what in God's name I've been doing. So I congratulate you for coming through your terrific journey. That's not fun. So welcome back.
Yes. So you must be, I'm trying to think of the various terms that people use, pantser versus plotter. I like to call it organic versus outlining, but I'm going to guess that you are not an outliner if you have to go back and reread to figure out what's happening.
Right. I have no clue.
Yeah.
I have a very dear friend of mine who's a short story writer, so he does a voluminous 10 pages and his work is done. But nevertheless, he and I share the same thing, which is when we put pen to paper, metaphorically speaking, of course, nowadays, we have no clue what we're doing. How do you do it? What's your approach?
Totally. I also have no clue. I figure if I'm surprised, then hopefully the readers will be surprised. And yeah. I love the first, it's interesting you said you stopped at page 100 because the first 100 pages are often, it's just, I'm throwing things out. Here's a character, here's an idea, let's chase them down this trail. And then comes the part where you actually have to figure out how it's all going to fit together, how it's going to work. And that's the really difficult part. You know, I sort of look at all this tangled spaghetti on the table and I have to line all the ends up. And it always amazes me at the end of every book that I actually come out, the mystery's been solved, they know who done it. Because I never know who's done it when I start out, and I often don't know, you know, who got done and how they did it.
So let me ask you a question now. I'm fascinated by this because I've actually had to do this not once but twice. I changed the bad guy. I finished the book. I reached page 300 or wherever it was, and I realized the bad guy just wasn't measuring up to expectation. He wasn't bad enough. He wasn't interesting enough. I don't know what he was, but he wasn't what I made him. So I changed the bad guy. Have you ever had that situation?
I have, although not as far in as you. I haven't gotten to the very end, but I have definitely gotten halfway through. I thought I knew, you know, who the bad guy was. I was setting, and then I realized, yeah, no, it's usually somehow, it's like you need somebody who's really compelling. You need someone who, even if we're not seeing, I think, a lot of the bad guy, the antagonist, it needs to be somebody who's got a lot of gravity, a lot of weight to pull in the book, because otherwise, you know, your heroes aren't going up against anything. It needs to be, you know, a battle worthy of your heroes. So
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm sorry. I've got a lot of questions because I love what you've done. Yeah, no. So you've got Claire on one side and Russ on the other, and I love the contrast right there. The people obviously enamored of one another to the point where they had a child, but they are. I'm thinking one is a priest, and she's got she's got baggage of her own. She carries this weight, the PTSD, I hope I'm not saying too much.
I think it's in the book flap, Archer. I think anybody who picks it up can figure that out.
Good. Okay. So, but then you got the cop, and I used to be one of them, and you know, they live in a fairly harsh, non-priest-like environment a lot. So this couple comes home at night. Do you have these wonderful sort of dramas in your head about the potential of what each one is going to bring? And do you write about it, or do you choose not to sometimes? It must be an interesting juggling match.
Well, you know, that's what attracted me to the idea of putting them as the protagonists to begin with, was because of their potential for clashing. I mean, we both know conflict is the engine that makes, you know, fiction run. People who are happy and contented, they're not as interesting.
They're boring.
And you know, I've been a long time really, you know, happy and contented and comfortable with was it Susan? His they broke up.
Robert Parker, he's dead. I'm still with you. So.
No. So I can't remember my own characters' names, let alone other people. But yeah, but you know, it's too much happiness is boring.
I kill him. I once had Joe in love with someone, and I loved her. I thought she was terrific, and so I had to kill her. Yeah.
It's a harsh life being a you know, a novelist, because you really have to. A very good editor told me once that a good writer loves their characters, but also keeps them far enough at a distance so that you can be very cold towards them. You know, you can do bad things them as necessary. And I think that's true. You know, sometimes you wind up killing someone and then your readers write in and they're like, no, how could you do that? Oh, she was so great.
They ran me through the ringer. Yeah. Dear Mr. Mayor, I loved your books. I'll never read another one again. You know, that was a cozy example. uh, so having said all,
like the saying goes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, carry on. As the saying goes.
Oh, I was going to say, as the saying goes, sometimes they just need killing.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. No. So that's perfect segue to my very next question. And I'm sorry that I'm hogging all this, but I want to pick your brains. We haven't seen each other for decades, for crying out loud. So, why mysteries? What were you writing before you started in the bleak of midwinter?
Bleak Midwinter. So I am a failed science fiction writer originally. That was what I read a lot of when I was a teen and in my early 20s. I still love science fiction. I read a lot. It's just not, it's not my row to hoe. I really have come to believe for a lot of cases that the genre chooses the writer and not the other way around. And what happened was I had started writing. I was involved with a book group. I started writing I'm just glowing here. I wrote about a half of a science fiction novel, and I took it to a writing conference and workshopped it with published authors and with other writing students. And everybody said that, my prose was publishable quality and my characters were well-rounded and my ideas about science fiction were unmarketable and out of date. Nobody was buying or reading that sort of thing anymore. So I took my manuscript, half a manuscript, home and looked it over, and what I had actually written was the start of a mystery. The whole plot was about years on the third page in the office of the heroine, and the whole story was, who was the dead guy, who killed him, how do they find the murderer before he or she strikes again. It was just said, you only have to hit me over the head once or twice at the most. And I thought maybe what I ought to do is read some mysteries, and and that's what I did. And you've heard, I think, maybe, I hope you remember this part of the story, which is one of the writers that I read was you. And this would have been in like 1998 or 99. So I'm not sure where you were with Joe's story, but
11 years.
And yeah. And you and Margaret Maron were actually the two biggest influences on me when I started out. I really loved, she was a few books in on her Bootlegger's Daughter series, mm-hmm. which I thought was a really, really good handling of an amateur sleuth. Her character was a judge with this really fascinating, complicated family life. And I liked the fact it was an amateur sleuth, but it felt psychologically real. I liked those sort of mysteries. And I loved what you did with setting. I mean, in every one of the Joe Gunther books, Vermont, wherever he is in Vermont, is as much of a character as the people, moving through the landscape. And the crimes, the characters, the people, for good or ill, in your books could not be something else. You couldn't pluck what happens out of it because it's a different place. And that's one of the things I love about crime fiction. I think that crime fiction is one of the few genres where people are really seriously digging into location and what it means, and how growing up or living in a certain type of place shapes everybody who's there. Anyway, I loved it. I copied what you did. Steal for the best. So
I'm deeply flattered. Thank you very much. But knowing your biography a little bit, a military bum, well, I should say brat is the more acceptable term. uh, and I, although my father wasn't in the military, he was chronically unemployable. So we both, you and I, wandered around like crazy. Now, you ended up in Maine, and yet your favorite place on earth was upstate New York, call it generally that. And you've done something interesting. Now, being cheap, I didn't want to drive around too much, so I write about Vermont, which is the state in which I reside. Now, you live in Maine, and yet you always write about upstate New York. Now, that's fascinating to me, because you either got a much more comfortable vehicle than I do, or or you teleport or something. How do you live in one state and write about the other?
I mean, who could turn down the chance to make research trips up to Washington County, New York? I mean, come on.
No,
it's glamour. It's never ending glamour. So
you're driving across Vermont. That's why you say that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. That's the really glamorous part. I've done it so many times. I know every single publicly open bathroom in Vermont going east and west.
You sound like a cop. You know that cops, when you're on patrol, they know every decent bathroom on them.
No, I need to put that detail in. I've not used that.
Oh, I'll give you something else.
I got to put that in mine.
Yeah, no, female cops
shoot.
are going to be pickier than male cops, not for cleanliness, but for the number of hooks inside the bathroom stall. Remember this. This is important. So if ever, I know that Claire doesn't carry a gun belt, but if ever you want to equip her, like if Russ hires her as an auxiliary for the police department, that's another thing I'll give you there. She will want bathroom stalls with hooks so she can hang her gun belt on the hook.
That makes absolute sense. That makes absolute 100% sense, and I can see it entirely. They're not very flattering for women either. That's a challenge.
No, that's true.
So
probably a male conspiracy.
Just like uniforms in the military. All right, what was location. Real estate. So when I started, now I know you're not a Vermont native, even though you're probably one of its best known, and so what I did was sort of the flip. I am not a Maine native, but I've lived here since I was 25 years old. I married a Mainer and moved here. But when I'm from the area that I write about, my family actually settled in Washington County in 1720. And so I have very deep roots going back there. And as we moved around, and I remember, you and I both have very peripatetic childhoods, this was where we would always come back. Summers, holidays, family visits. It was always in this part of New York State. And then when my dad was out of the military, we settled there. And when I started writing, I felt like I didn't know Maine well enough to really write about it. And and you do too, there are people who write stories about places they've barely been. They visit once and then they Google the rest. And they're great. I mean, they convey it really well. I am not one of those people. I really need, I need to have a real deep feel for what a place is like to write about it. And so when I started, I didn't think I knew Maine well enough. Well, now I've lived in Maine for 30 years, and I know it well enough. If I can ever get up to speed where I can write, a book each year, I might be able to write a book about Maine and sort of slip it in with my series.
Well, that'd be fun.
Which makes me think. Let me ask. Well, here's something that I am curious about, because this is the 9th book in my series, and it's the 10th. And you know, you build this environment. I've got a cop shop like you do. I mean, yours is really front and center. Mine is center. You have everybody and all their relationships and their family members and things. And I'm curious as to sort of how you keep it going and keep it fresh. I mean, the mystery plots are easy in that sense. You know, there's always some sort of new twist on crime, or an old twist on crime. But, you know, you get up and there's a lot of years and a lot of, as you mentioned, Claire's got a lot of baggage. They start dragging a lot of baggage behind them. So, I mean, tell me how you keep it fresh. Because I want this advice from me. I'm going to steal this from you too.
Yeah, I have an advantage over you in that I occasionally, as well as killing off people with whom I've gotten overly fond. I've introduced, even from the start, I introduced more people than you had available, and that was just dumb luck. I had so little thought going into this process. It's laughable, but I have 4 major players in this series of books, and Margot and I, funnily enough, were just talking about this earlier before we got on the air. And the 4 major characters, one is Joe, who is sort of the walking human saint. The other is Willie, who is everything not. Okay, so there I've got a wonderful contrast right there. I used to play with the notion, in fact, that they were one human being in 2 characters, because we have our good days and our bad days. Those are Joe days and Willie days. I tell people, you may wake up every morning hoping to have a Joe day, but you'll end up with your first Willie moment within the first 10 minutes, I'll guarantee you. And then I have, Sammy, a female who is also driven and has different baggage than Willie's. And last but not least, I would carefully introduce very early on Lester. And Lester is the everyman. He's utterly normal, as normal as we human beings can be. So that's allowed me an extraordinary latitude. So I can walk away. I can have almost an entirely Willie book, and then I can do a Joe book or a Sammy book, and on it goes. That helps me a lot because I am uncomfortably aware of the very point you brought up, which is I don't want my readers to ever report back to me, read your latest, wow, it was boring. I am so tired of your characters.
No author wants to hear.
No, exactly right. Because you and I are like captains of the Exxon Valdez. By the time they screen Rock, it's too late. The book's out.
Yeah.
So now let me turn that around slightly for you. This book of yours is just out, and Claire's in trouble. And so you've come from somewhere and you're heading somewhere, at least I hope so.
Yeah.
And you sort of almost end on a cliffhanger along the lines of character. What, like your mother might say, what were you thinking? In a way,
what was I thinking? Yeah.
What were you thinking?
Well, Claire wound up, so her problem is addiction. And interestingly enough, that was not something I had ever planned out. It started out, I'm afraid I was a little cliched when I started my first book. Like you had said, I didn't plan anything about a series. I just sort of backed through the bush into it. Russ was the cop was the one who was an ex-alcoholic. I think I just probably read a lot of books where cops were either alcoholics or ex-alcoholics. I'm like, well, I better make him. And that's never been an issue for him. But somewhere like around the, 4th book, I noticed Claire was really drinking a lot. And it was nothing that I had intended. It was just one of those serendipitous moments. I'm sure you've had these too, where all of a sudden you realize that you've kind of been building this character trait without even realizing it. And she goes off to war, and she comes back, and she comes back with addiction, which happens to a lot of people. And she, you know, she's struggling to deal with it. And I decided, when I decided that I was affirmatively going to go ahead and say, yes, she's drinking way too much and she's taking pills, that it wasn't going to be the sort of character problem where at the end of the book, it was going to be all over. I find that a little annoying, you know, that sort of the bonanza theory of writing fiction, where your characters have like one traumatic event or one real problem, and at the end of the book, it's all over. Sort of like, remember the Bonanza episodes where like little Joe would have a fiance and then she'd die at the end, and then you never hear anything again.
No, they're gone.
Oh, who's that? Yeah, they're gone. So I figured this is going to be something that she was going to have to keep dealing with, because that's what happens when you're an addict, is you have to keep dealing with it. And she really hasn't even admitted it to herself. So it's been an ongoing through line. And, you know, I'm sure with this book that I'm working on now, where that's going. I mean, I don't want to bore people with it. You don't want to have every book have your character have the same issues and the same challenges, as you know. So it'll be interesting. And I also ended this book on, I had an epilogue in this book, which is just a blatant cliffhanger, a plot cliffhanger, for which I will blame, if people don't like it, my editor, who is, I don't know who your editor is. Do you have Pete Wolverton?
No, I have Keith Kayla.
Oh, he's smart. He's a smart guy.
Yeah, that actually, well, okay. You finish up your thought, and I have an editing question for you too.
Okay, good. So anyway, I'd finished the book, and it sort of ended on this, you know, thoughtful note, and then my editor Pete got back to me and said, no, you have to put a cliffhanger there. And I said, but I left the last book was a cliffhanger, more or less. Claire is pregnant, but she hasn't had a baby. And I've had people sending me emails for 6 years saying, this is the longest pregnancy in human history. You know, what's happening? And I didn't want to leave people with a cliffhanger again. My editor said, no, you people love cliffhangers. You need to leave a cliffhanger. So audience, if you don't like it, Pete Wolverton at stmartins.com. You're going to address complaints to him.
Isn't that funny? I don't know that I've done that much. I've done it a little bit, but I guess I'm not too consistent about cliffhangers. But I have a different relationship with my editor than you, and only because I have, give or take, depending on the book, half a dozen people, Margot being paramount among them, who are my readers. And so all my editing happens in-house. The manuscripts go out and come back and go out and come back before Keith Kayla gets the manuscript. So unbeknownst to him, except of course now I've just outed myself, he gets this hyper edited book, and it's not just edited by myself, but by other people. So by the time it's all said and done, I probably had 20 edits of the full book.
Wow.
Again and again and again, just parsing and parsing and cleaning and making every sentence responsible for its task. So do you have anybody, sadly now that Ross is no longer there.
Ross?
Yeah, but
yeah.
Head and Shoulders, who do
you know,
have
You know, I'm really short on readers right now. I did have 3 people who would read and offer suggestions. I've always found it really useful to have triangulation. When my theory was that, you know, if one person says, I don't like this scene, then I'm the judge of it. If you have 3 people who say, I don't like this scene, or I don't understand, or there's something missing, then you've got a problem and you need to address it. And it was a local librarian, and oddly enough, a very dear friend of mine who was my next door neighbor, but just had a really good eye, and my mother. And the librarian retired, my mother passed away, and my friend and neighbor moved to Colorado, which makes it a little bit less convenient to run over to her house and go over the manuscript with a bottle of wine, which is the best way to go over a manuscript. No, I need to have like an in-house group like you do. Keith, your editor must think that you are just an incredible genius, handing in these pristine manuscripts.
Yeah, totally true. And I do not disabuse him.
Never do. So I'm wondering, I can see David there.
Yep.
I'm wondering if we should open up and do some questions. I see he's muted, but I can't see what he's doing there.
Okay, let me unmute myself. I think that's a great idea. Are there, if anyone has a question, I saw one question in the chat earlier about what's the use of maps. Do you guys have strong feelings about maps in your fiction?
I saw too. I wasn't sure if it was a question about sort of, maps, or whether they can find places by using maps. I've only ever had a map in to orient people.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I mean, with Archer's books, you could probably use what Archer writes as a map to drive across Vermont, because they're very detailed, extremely accurate. And what I do is my town, Miller's Kill, is sort of a fictionalized version. It's based on the town of Hudson Falls. You notice that I mention in the book, if you read the books, I mention lots of towns and villages around Hudson Falls, but Hudson Falls itself is never mentioned. That's kind of because Miller's Kill is more or less Hudson Falls. And, one of the advantages that I have of working with a fictional setting or a fictional town instead of the real places like Archer does, is I never have to worry about getting details wrong. The Stewart's gas station is where I say it is, and you can't show me a Google map that says you got this one wrong. So that's a big advantage. But I certainly hope that if you read my books, you feel like if you were coming up the Northway, if you could just find the right exit, you could probably drive to Miller's Kill. That's my thought on maps.
That's great. Archer, I've got a question here for you. And I know this you had in my correspondence with Margot. That's why I'm highlighting this one. I know you were doing a little research on the road, or you were supposed to. When you leave Vermont to set action in Massachusetts or New York City, how much time, if any, do you spend on the road?
I will always go where I write about it. So in a book many years ago, half of it takes place in Chicago. The reason it takes place in Chicago is because I'd never been there. So I jumped on a plane and I went to Chicago, and I spent a single week there. Now, people with my background and Julia's background, we get out there, she and I, and learn to inhabit a place quickly. You make friends, you lose friends, you become a quick study. As a child, some of that is a survival skill. I'm sure Julia would agree that when you constantly are entering a new school, you better be personable and quick, and have a thick skin and get along with people. but with the curious aspect that you're also not going to keep many of them as long-lasting friends because dad's going to go out the door soon and you're going to follow him. So it's a weird coexistence, but it does leave the following advantage, which Julia may benefit from also, and that is you can go to a place like I referred to Chicago, you know who to talk to as an interview, you know what photographs to take or what memories to preserve, and 1 week later, you return home, you write the book, and you'll get letters saying, oh, wow, you really caught it. Now, boy, how many years did you live in Chicago? And comments like that. It's a trick. I mean, the writers have more tricks than a gambler does. And part of the trick is being able to present to the reader enough to sort of make them think, oh, he really knows what he's talking about. And I remember that about Chicago, and oh, yes, yes. And you let their imaginations fill in the gaps that you may not even have known about.
I have a question here from the chat
I
for Julia.
Yes.
Which so it's been several years since the last book and Claire was pregnant. Does the new book pick up with her pregnant or have the same number of years passed?
No, the same number of years have not passed. I was discussing this somewhere. I think astute readers will actually notice that the present day timeline in Hid From Our Eyes is not actually 2019 or 2020. It's earlier than that. We start having to, elide the years a little bit. But no, the story takes up a little bit after the baby has been born. So we've got, the Russ and Claire dealing with new parenthood, and I am dealing with the challenge of, as a writer, having a couple that, slews together, at least participates in different aspects of crime together, but also are, parenting. And it's kind of hard. I sort of wish I could do like a soap opera does and just have like the eternally available nanny. You know how like a baby is born in a soap opera and there's always somebody who can take care of it when the parents are doing dramatic things. And then the baby comes on for a little, a little cameo. And then you turn around and about 2 years later, the baby is 15 and can do stories himself. So actually, interestingly enough, one of the things that I am considering for the next book, not the 10th book that I'm working on now, but the very hazily imagined 11th book, is actually jumping forward in time by a few years, to sort of fast forward the narrative by 4 or 5 years, so that they've got a child in school, in kindergarten. And there's some things that I'd like to do with some of the peripheral characters that would be a little bit tedious if I had to work them through it year by year. But, boom, all of a sudden people are changed and there's new events and new things coming on. So it'll be interesting. I like the idea. I don't know if I've read any other books where someone has done a noticeable narrative leap in the timeline. Can you think of any booksellers? Archer?
Sure. What's his name? Who writes the Easy Rollins books? He moves around like crazy.
Oh yeah, but is he going up but he goes forward and back, doesn't he? He's like covering Easy's like timeline, like you're traveling along this one. So yeah. So what I've been doing is just going pretty much straight forward in time, and with the idea of kicking it forward. Let's see. Look at
the comment about timelines actually makes me
Walter,
think.
Walter Mosley.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, somebody has it. David has it. Yeah. Thanks.
I was just jumping in to say that talking about timelines has made me think more about something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is how people who write contemporary fiction are going to deal with right now. the present moment. And I wondered if that's something that either of you have been thinking about lately as we're all in our homes.
Oh, heck. Yeah. I mean, how can you not? I think in the discussions that I've had with writer friends, everybody is sort of thinking about it. My view is, on the one hand, everywhere you turn, there's an amazing plot potential, especially if you're writing crime fiction. I mean, holy cow, there's just so much potential for dramatic, crimes to occur. On the other hand, I think that when you've got something that is just a huge national, wrench, I think it takes a few years for that to kind of sift down through the culture, sift through writers, so you get something that's really good, that's well written about it. I can see moving forward having it being a mention, like, oh, do you remember back in the pandemic when we couldn't do this? But I think good fiction that really deals with it, I think that's going to take a while. I think it's going to take a while. And the example that always comes to my mind is The Things They Carried, which is most, now I'm going to forget the author's name. Who wrote The Things That They Carried? See, we really can't remember anybody. Thank you. One of the most moving and beautiful and affecting books about, pieces of fiction about the Vietnam War. It was published in 1990. So, a decade and a half or more after the end of the war. It takes that much time to really, really create something that deals with a trauma well.
I think we have time for one last question, and there are a bunch of great ones in the chat, so I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them. But this is sort of a fun one for Archer, which I'm actually going to expand to both of you. How would you physically describe your main characters? So tell us what they look like in your mind.
They don't. They're voices. It's easy. Yeah, no, I once upon a time envisioned Joe as a vision of my father before I knew my father. Okay, so my father is a man in his 40s, maybe something like that. But I sort of then abandoned that because he began to age. He died at the age of 99. So I always knew him as sort of an older guy, and so it was an image on an image. And the rest of them, we know Willie has one arm that's futzed up, and but other than that, I sort of want all of you to imagine. I mean, we have visions of the voices that we extract from a page, and I want those visions to be yours. So while I flirted with the idea of describing people when I began this series 400 years ago, I've given that up. So they look like what you want them to look like.
Yeah, I know what Joe looks like, in here. This is actually, Archer and I are in complete agreement on this, and I probably stole it from him as well back in the day. What I believe in trusting the reader to make connections. I don't think you need to spell everything out for readers. If there's sort of a subtle allusion to an event that happened earlier in the book, I'm not going to hit you over the head with it. I expect that you're going to make the connection yourself. And I really trust readers, like Archer does, to create those pictures in their heads. And I think it's more effective than actually describing. So my two main characters, Russ he's a tall guy. He's, a few inches over 6 feet and kind of sturdy, and he's got sandy hair. And Claire has got like dirty blonde hair, and her face is all points and angles. Now, what does that mean? It probably means something different for you than it did when the face that I envisioned. Points and angles doesn't describe a lot, but it also gives a little hook for the imagination to rest on. And I find that people, and you probably do as well, Archer, people have really strong images in their own head of what your characters look like, which is great because that makes them more real in the mind of the reader.
Yeah, and that's, of course, part of the writer's trick is if you can make the reader be a co-storyteller, you've hooked them.
Yeah. This is why Archer does not need to have cliffhangers, is because he's good enough to keep people coming back without them.
No, I pay them all. I pay them all.
Oh, is that?
So I think that's a great note to wrap up on. This has been an incredible privilege and pleasure for me, and I think for everyone here. It's wonderful to have such great guest authors. It's wonderful to see all of your faces. Both authors' books are available at northshire.com with free shipping on all web orders. So those web orders that we've been getting have been a lifeline for keeping the Vermont store sort of a little bit open right now, and then hopefully being able to reopen the Saratoga store when it's safe to do that. So thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you so much, Archer and Julia, for an incredible evening. And everyone, please consider ordering their books at northshire.com. And we will see you all again in a happier time when we can all cram into the store's event spaces together.
Right, and before you leave, I want to plug next week's Northshire live events. We have decided we're going to alternate the password every week. And so let me type in the chat what it's going to be. It's going to be, if I can type it in, Earth Day NSBS. Likewise, you can join our newsletter. If you go to our website, there are links, and I posted a link here as well for where you can join up and sign up for our Events Manchester or Events Saratoga newsletters to see what's coming up, to get our password, get your passwords for next week's events, which we're going to have 2 next week, and that's on Wednesday. Environmentalist legend Gus Speth will be discussing climate change with climate pioneer Edward Cameron on Wednesday at 5. And then Rachel, you want to tell us about Thursday?
On Thursday at 5 will be 2 great historical fiction authors, Tara Shea Nesbitt for her brand new book Beheld, which got a huge rave in the New York Times Book Review, and then one of my personal favorites, Kim Van Alcamada, talking about her book Bachelor Girl. So 2 fantastic historical fiction authors on Thursday at 5. Thank you so much, Julia and Archer, and everyone for being here tonight.
Yes, thank you all so much. This has been fun.
Bye.
Thanks.